Good afternoon. This is Debbie Q, and you're listening to The Right Shoe. The Right Shoe is a podcast about the strange and unusual, especially in references to death or mysterious, unusual happenings. Things that freak us out or make us question everything. The cases I've done so far have some sort of connection with Philadelphia, although there's a few that are coming up that are not from Philadelphia, but they're so interesting that I think I'm going to just sway one time because I am not the greatest with social media. I do have an Instagram account. My Twitter account is bookshopworm1. Which I use. I tried to do everything the right shoe, and it's difficult for me, I have to be honest. I have so many pictures, and I like things to be centrally located. In this next case, people actually got in touch with me, IMing me, texting me. I've never heard of this case that I'm going to do today beforehand. This case is making me crazy. There is so much material to cover. It's so bizarre that this is actually probably the fourth time I'm taping the show to edit. It's just one of those cases. I want to do it in order so that it makes sense. It's up there in the top 5 strangest cases I have ever heard. It's the case of Ellen Greenberg. I had never heard of it before. I'm surprised. It is a very strange case. There's a show called Accident, Suicide, and Murder. Somebody said, you gotta watch this show. I guess the second season was starting and they made Ellen Greenberg the first case. It's on Oxygen. When I watched it, I just was very surprised. And then I know people in the homicide unit of Philadelphia, so I asked them about it. Because sometimes they'll tell me about cases that are unusual, and then I'll investigate them myself. I really don't. I try to keep separated from them for many reasons. And I do ask for their opinions of what they think happened, but I try not to let it sway me. When you're in an inner city homicide unit, as opposed to smaller towns or places where homicides aren't so prevalent, Philadelphia is extremely high. We might even hit like 400 homicides this year. Not that that's something to be proud of. It's terrible. But the point is there's the homicide unit gets a lot of action. So they see things differently than, say, Snowshoe, Pennsylvania. In the city, if they get it wrong the first time, it's not this crazy big deal. It's not a small town where people know everybody or something happens and somebody has it in for somebody else. It's just too big. And there's too many homicides. Anyway, this case, Ellen Greenberg, I'm going to try to go over it slowly. I don't want to miss anything. First off, Ellen Greenberg was beautiful. I mean, she was gorgeous. Like long dark hair, bright eyes. Just a very pretty girl. That was my initial impression. When you first look at Ellen Greenberg, you see this beautiful 27-year-old female. She's just got out of school, got a job teaching. She's so excited. She's going to get married. Her parents, they live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is about 2 hours west of here. It's the capital of Pennsylvania. She lived in Manayunk, which is a very nice section of Philadelphia. And Ellen Greenberg's life, for all intents and purposes, looked to be the life of a princess. What could be wrong, you think? You know, you look at somebody, would look at her walking down the street and think, oh, I wish I was her. You know, she's got it going on. Ellen Greenberg was going to get married to Samuel Goldberg. They lived in, as I said, Manayunk. They lived in a place called Venice Loft Apartments. I am not familiar with Manayunk so much. Manayunk is northwest of the city. I am northeast. So, and pretty much my whole life I've lived here, except when I went to college, and I lived by New York for a couple of years. Outside, and in Pittsburgh for a year. Outside of that, I've always lived in Philly. So I know the city pretty well. Mostly I lived in the Northeast. So Manayunk is all the way up. Like, I'm trying to give you a visual. There's a boulevard here, a 6-lane boulevard that starts in the beginning of the city and ends, you would think, at the end of the city, and that's what it seems like. And when I was younger, when I just started driving, I would take the boulevard just to drive, and it would go, you go all the way up. It's like 9th Street. And I thought that was the end. I thought that was the end of Philly. Here, it becomes this 2-lane highway, and it goes off of City Line Avenue. And if you go west, you're going to hit the suburbs, like Conshohocken, Brooklyn, where King of Prussia is, King of Prussia Mall, Warminster, Bucks County, all those places. It's towards or Montgomery County, it's towards the west. Right between, in like a little nook, the outer edges of Philly and the suburbs is Manayunk, and it's a part of Philadelphia. It just always seems strange to me. I just never got that far. Except a few times when one time I went, it's called the Manayunk Wall. The people would bike race against that wall. And I knew somebody who worked there, and they knew somebody that lived there. So we went to his apartment, which was on the second floor, and we got to watch the whole entire bike race. It was so cool. It was so hilly. I'm like, I can't imagine these people riding their bikes. Like, how do they do it? Then the next time I went, this woman, Kitty, when I was 21, back then when you turned 21 and you worked, it was in the 1990. I mean, we're talking some time ago. People took you to the bar when you turned 21. Today it would be so non-PC. So she took me to the River Cafe, which was on the Schuylkill River, and it was gorgeous. I just remember that night. It was like a nice breezy night. It was fun and it was beautiful, and it was in Manayunk. The bar had closed years ago. So I always had this good impression of Manayunk, and I mean, I still do. It's a nice little section of the city. Now, when I was watching the Greenberg case, and then when I started delving into it more, I was amazed at these Renaissance apartments. They are gorgeous. Ellen Greenberg and her fiance lived on the 6th floor, and just the few apartments that I saw visually are stunning. You could see the entire Philadelphia skyline, and you could see the Schuylkill River. It was very close to the Schuylkill River. They're beautiful apartments. Again, you're thinking, wow, look at this girl. I mean, Then a strange thing happened. One day, Samuel Goldberg went to the gym for about 30 minutes. Now, the gym was in their complex. It wasn't like when I first heard the story, I thought it was like an off-site gym. And I'm like, wow, 30 minutes, that's not a lot of time. But here it was right on the ground floor. They were on the 6th floor. He just ran down, worked out. When he came back upstairs, the door was locked. It wasn't just locked. He couldn't get in because the swing bolt, which they have in hotels, the swing lock, it's not like the old chain locks. You could still bust through a chain lock pretty easily. You just had to slam that door open. With the swing bolt, the way it shuts, it's harder to get into. You can, but it's harder. He comes up and the swing bolt's on, and he's knocking on the door, and she's not answering, and he's texting her pretty aggressive text like, hello, where are you? What's going on? Let me the F in. Open this effing door. And he's getting mad. I would be pissed too if I couldn't get in my house. I'm the same way. I'm not always a hothead, but at times I am. And if I came home and the swing bolt was on, I wouldn't be too happy either. So he's not happy. He goes downstairs, the security guard, because he can't get in. The security guard wants nothing to do with this. And I don't blame him. When you're in those kind of rich sections, you just don't do stuff like that. It's going to come back to you. So the security guard says, I'm not breaking in the door. So he goes back up. He busts through the door and he finds Ellen slumped against the wall. It's got to be a shock. So he goes over, he calls 911, and they're telling him to give her CPR until I guess the way she was slumped over, and she had long hair. When he pulled her back, there was like a very large kitchen knife. I think it was serrated too, inside her chest. So obviously they told him to stop the CPR, and the police come first and then the homicide unit. I'm not sure of that, but I know eventually the homicide unit did get there. Their initial walkthrough, they said there was no point of entry. She was sitting in one spot and the blood was in one spot. There was no defensive wounds. They just put down suicide. I did ask, I said, is that unusual for them to say suicide so quickly? And they said, yeah, they aren't exactly sure why somebody wrote suicide so quickly. They said that actually was unusual, but they did, and they sent Ellen off to the medical examiner's office. And the medical examiner, when he initially got her, he writes down homicide. She comes in, she has 20 stab wounds, 10 are on the back of her neck. She has bruises, and not only just bruising, but they were like old bruises. And she had almost ligature marks. He wasn't sure if they were ligature marks or hand marks around her neck, like strangulation. marks. So he wrote, and then of course the big knife in her chest, and the one with stab one was in her stomach. So he just wrote homicide, and that was that. Apparently, I don't know how the paperwork runs, because I'll tell you a story right after this. When the homicide unit got back to the medical examiner, his last name was Osborne, they said, no, it wasn't a suicide. It wasn't a homicide. It was a suicide. There was no point of entry. She was in the one spot. I guess he must have wrote homicide, and then they called the homicide unit, and they said, oh no, we went to that. There was no defensive wounds. It was a suicide. And in the beginning, it was just like that with the back and forth. They really didn't think anything of it. They were just relaying the information. Later, that would become a big point of contention, especially with, there was a guy named Tom Brennan. He came to represent the family because he strongly feels this was a homicide. Now, he kept saying, why would the ME change the homicide to suicide? And that was a big deal. But I have to say, as I was investigating the story, it was odd that this happened. There was a case about a week ago where there was a gentleman who, I don't know who found him, inside either his house or a place of business. I'm not sure which. I just know what happened. He was dead. The homicide unit investigated. They sent it down to the ME. He called it a homicide until they got a tape inside the house and inside the place of business, wherever he was. And it showed he had been smoking PCP. Now, when he got very high, he started banging his head against the wall. Well, he banged his head so hard that he knocked himself out. He killed himself. It's all in the video. You could see him banging his head against the wall, and then he falls to the ground, and he's dead. So when the homicide unit called back, relaying this information, the ME put down accidental death. But it stuck in my head because I'm thinking, well, that doesn't seem like such a big deal to change the opinion. I think there's so many deaths that come in, and there's probably an overworked medical examiner. I don't know how many are there at one time, but if it's one or two, and you got so many people coming in, you just must write something down initially, and then as you get more information, you can change it or to fit the information coming in. That brings us back to Ellen. There's 20 stab wounds. There's old bruises. There's a ligature or something like a ligature mark around her neck. And there was a blood strand from her nose down to her lip, I think. And it had dried. Now, I guess some were saying that the way she was laying, she would have had to have been moved. Otherwise, the way the blood had fallen, it would have been impossible, like it defied gravity. Whoever investigated it, though, believes that she was leaning over the sink, had stabbed herself in the back of the neck, fell against the wall, and then did the final plunge of the knife into the chest. That's why blood was flowing that way, because she had fallen backwards. She was leaning over, and then she was backwards. So that still makes sense to me. I don't see anything wrong with even anything I've heard yet. The thing that alarmed me was the actual method of death, the stabbing. Now, when the homicide people came in, they said there was no point of entry. It was snowing that year. They were on the 6th floor, so it would be kind of hard to get in through the patio anyway. The front door had that swing bolt on it from her fiance's key card. He left at 4:45, and then the key card shows him coming back around 5:25. So he was only going a half hour. That's not a lot of time for a stranger to come in and kill her. The thing with the stabbing is, I agree. I started to go through, right off the bat, because the stabbing is so bizarre. That's why I wanted to talk about it for a minute. There's a lot of things that go with this stabbing. First off, for suicide, the stabbing is so unusual. I went through every suicide book I could find, and there was this one really comprehensive study, this Nepal study of suicide. I guess Nepal being in Asia, but it was such a good, well-rounded view of suicide, and it broke down how each sex kills themselves, what's the most common method. Women, they're more apt to try to commit suicide, where men may be less apt to try it. When they do, they are more successful. The men, the number one was shooting. Number two was gas. And for women, number one was poisoning, or overdosing on pills. That is what is just so bizarre. The stabbing or with a knife was accounted for less than 2% of all suicides. And not only that, but there wasn't even any literature. They wrote multiple, and this was before Ellen died. They wrote, there's no literature that we can find that has multiple self-stabbings. So literally, if Ellen had committed suicide, this is like one of the rarest of suicides, self-stabbing, but it's stabbing oneself multiple times. The thing that bugs me the most is the stabbing in the back of the neck. I cannot understand that. It's just really bizarre. Even if she was leaning over the sink, why was she stabbing herself in the back of the neck? And yet these stab wounds weren't really stab wounds in the back of the neck. They were just hesitation marks. She or whoever were literally just kind of jabbing at the neck. One of them must have been more severe than others. Another debate came about when a Lucy Rourke Adams, she was the pathologist that did the autopsy. Now, initially, she had wrote that the spinal cord, which is encapsulated in like a sheath, she said that it was not broken, it was merely bruised. That's what she wrote. However, when the family hired Wayne Ross to do another autopsy, he said that the sheath was broken. Now, right off the bat, if the sheath was broken, then all bets are off. It's a homicide. She couldn't do anything after nicking her spinal cord. It would have rendered her paralyzed. When they went back to ask Lucy Rourke Adams about this, she said, nobody paid me for this. I don't remember this case. I don't know what anyone's talking about. So everyone thought it was kind of strange because they had went in and asked for the report. They wanted a paper report of what Lucy Rourke Adams had written, and they said they couldn't find it. And then she said she never did it. But when I asked about that, I was told she wouldn't have gotten a check written in her name. She would have been getting checks from the city of Philadelphia. That's what they think. And plus, the case had gotten so big by now, and there was so much controversy. Who would blame her for saying she didn't remember this case? I wouldn't want to remember it either. It's a strange case. So you have to investigate further what was going on in her life. She's beautiful. She's getting married. She's a teacher. That's what she went to school for. So you have to break it down. Now, the first thing is they found on her computer several searches for painless suicide, how to commit suicide. Now, death by stabbing is hardly painless, but she was looking up suicide. Not only that, they found a few texts that she had wrote. One of them, she wrote to her mother. It said, I am just starting the meds. I know you don't understand, but I can't keep feeling this way. And they said when they initially interviewed the mother, she was saying, I think guilt was getting to her because apparently Ellen wanted to come home. Not only did she want to come home, she was complaining the kids at school were driving her crazy. I don't think she elaborated, but the mom kept saying, you're a big girl. You got to pick yourself up by the bootstraps and, move forward. And I don't think she was too sympathetic with the medication, and that's apparent in her text. And this is by no means, please believe me, blaming anybody. I'm just trying to get across everything that I read about this story, because it is confusing, perplexing, and baffling. That being said, she was taking Ambien, and they had given her Xanax initially, and then they changed it to Klonopin. She said the Xanax was too strong. I completely agree. I've taken both. I always liked Klonopin better. I don't like Xanax. It's too strong for me too. And because I've had many bouts of anxiety and depression in my life. I'm not a big fan of antidepressants, but the anti-anxiety medications that I've taken have been effective. Do I think that these anti-anxiety medications had I don't think if you're taking them, I don't think it one way or another would, if you're going to commit suicide, I don't feel that taking medication is either going to push you further or not push you further. Medication seems to work and then it doesn't. I've taken different medications throughout my life. It never swayed me one way or the other. They've helped. But then eventually they stop working and then you still got to do it yourself. Ultimately, I mean, except for anxiety, which there are like something like Klonopin, like depression is to me something you really have to just focus on to get through it. Where anxiety, I think like women with hormones and everything, we have so much going on. I do believe that anti-anxiety medication does help and continues to help, but I don't think it sways you towards suicide or not suicide. Like if you're going to do it, you're going to do it. If you're not going to do it, you're not going to do it. Suicide is what it is. I don't think medication or seeing a psychiatrist or anything like that has anything to do with anything. That was a moot point for me. When I was going over all of this, her taking medication just didn't have anything to do with it. I don't think she took it and went crazy. Even though Ambien, I've taken Ambien and I couldn't stand that. I hated the way it made me feel. And I know many other people that had very bad effects with Ambien. But I still don't think that had anything to do with what happened. I really don't. I think that was just an unfortunate byproduct of her situation. It is disturbing, especially that she wrote painless death. And that was far from painless. Stabbing yourself with a serrated knife is not painless. I have to say, and this is a personal story, I had an uncle who, he was, I think in his 60s, he got cancer and I think he was in a lot of pain and he became very depressed. Now, his wife at the time, she did not want him to see a psychiatrist. She was very against it. It was the thought of, oh, we are, you don't do that kind of stuff. Like a little bit snobby about it. My uncle and my other uncle owned a business together and there was like a drill press in the business and my uncle actually committed suicide with the drill press. And I don't think that was painless, but he did it. And he was found by one of the workers the next day. My other uncle, of course, sold that business and I don't think ever talked about it again, but it happens. And that sounds horrendous. I can't imagine. Oh my goodness. And I know a young kid found them and that scene had to be terrible, but he did it and it wasn't painless. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't think a drill press sounds like it was pain-free, just like these stabbings. I really am thrown off by that back of the neck, though, more so than the stabbing, because there's been famous people like Charlie Rockets. He went into the woods one day. He was the villain in Dumb and Dumber. He was on Saturday Night Live. He was in a couple movies. He was good, but I guess he got into a depression. He went into the woods and he sliced his throat and died. His wife found him in the woods later on. So this situation, when they say Occam's razor, the easiest answer is the best answer, you can't even apply here. There's no easy answer. This situation, it's more like the totality of the evidence is the answer. So you have to go through what was going on. As a teacher, where she worked was in Juniata Park. Now, I know the Juniata Park section of Philadelphia. It's not the worst section, but it's not the best. The children are very strong-willed, even elementary children. If they were driving her crazy, quote unquote, who's to say? She's going to work. She thought, I'm a teacher. I'm going to take on the world. My friend is a counselor in the Northeast section at an elementary school, and she is going through a terrible time right now. She says, Deb, it is really hard. The parents don't want to hear anything about their kids, and the kids know that they have the upper hand, and that's the way it goes. I'm sure that was frustrating. You got this young, pretty girl coming out of school. Her mom's telling her to buck up. She's stressed out at work. And then we get to the boyfriend. Now, there's several things that stick out to me. Of course, when he came up and knocked on the door, the texts were very aggressive. Open this effing door. What the F is going on? And so on. if they were fighting or something, maybe he went to the gym to cool off, came back upstairs, maybe even felt a little guilty. Supposedly he was wearing Timberland boots to go to the gym, and that seemed to strike some people as odd. I don't know. I've worn really strange things to go to the gym because I've been coming from work and I might have not have thrown my sneakers in the car, but he was home. So, okay, kind of get that. But if they were fighting, maybe he just went out to cool off and went to the gym and that's why it was so short. It was only going like 35 minutes. It really couldn't have been a stranger. There's no way. There was no point of entry. To be honest with you, I mean, I lean towards suicide only because there was no point of entry. He had to break the door down to get her. Did he kill her before he left? It's a possibility. I mean, I can't say no, I wasn't there. The way the stab wounds were, it's just too bizarre. I mean, as much as I don't think somebody would stab themselves like that, I think even less of somebody else stabbing somebody like that. Nobody's going to nick somebody in the back of the neck 10 times. Like little tiny nicks. And then this one big jab. Although Tom Brennan said he thinks it was like a blitz attack where they stabbed her in the back of the neck and then she turned around, but there's no defensive wounds and there was no blood. Like the blood was located in one area. And the thing with the little part of the blood coming out of her nose, if she was leaning over the sink and then fell backwards, of course the blood is going to it's not going to follow a normal trail. The blood, just like guns, does funny things. Yes, there is a whole science to blood, absolutely. But it doesn't always follow the right pattern. And this is definitely outside of the box, this whole case. If she committed suicide, again, she was one of the first to multiply stab herself. I can't get over that back of the neck, though. That's the one part that bothered me, but it doesn't make sense. The thing about her having the bruises and the strangulation marks, I will be honest, and I will tell you what my opinion is of what happened and what was going on in her life. This is my opinion. I could be completely wrong. Taking in everything I've read, I think that Ellen was being abused by her fiance. I do. I think that's why she wanted to come home. I think the kids at school were driving her insane. I think she was like a young girl that when you're 26, you still have that, like, life is, when you're young, you want to believe that life is always going to turn out rosy or eventually, if you do good things happen. And then as you get older, you see how messed up life really can be. And bad things do happen to good people. I've had some very effed up things happen to me that I don't think I deserved. And yet, the older you get, though, it becomes easier to deal with from my experience. But Ellen was still young, and to get out of school and have not only her to come out and be all gung-ho about teaching, and then, you're in a neighborhood that's not the greatest neighborhood. Perhaps the kids really were driving her crazy. Who knows if anything else might have been going on. I think that she was going to school, being stressed out, and then coming home and getting into massive fights with her boyfriend. I don't know who the instigator was, but I do think he was knocking her around a little bit. She had too many bruises on her, and the strangulation marks around her neck. There's no way she tried to hang herself first, because there would have been evidence of that somewhere. Though, when her boyfriend had found her. I think she was just started taking the medication. It may or may not have been working. She came home from work. They got into another fight. She might have freaked out, and he was like, oh my God, I'm going down to the gym. Made her felt a little guilty, come back up, and she was like, jab, 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 I'll show you. And then, like, the neuropathology of it, they were saying, like, they were really getting into it. It could have been on the accident, murder, suicide show, or it could have been many articles that I read. And they were saying, like, if you're stabbing yourself, you eventually get into this woozy state where, she could have literally nicked something that rendered it easier for her to stab herself in the chest. That's the one that killed her. And I think that's what happened. She came home from work, got into a fight. I'll show you. She did it in a bizarre way, but the only thing she had access to, the pills were too long for her. Maybe she thought, I don't want to do that. I just want to get it over with. Or maybe she was doing it thinking that he would come home, and then it was a cry for help. In my second podcast, my friend Cliff had hung himself, but he did it at a time when somebody was supposed to have walked through that door. Unfortunately, everyone was tied up that day. We all believed that he was almost doing it as a cry for help, but it went too far. I deeply, sincerely believe that she was crying out for help. The blitz, I agree with Tom Brennan, but because I think she blitzed herself. I just truly believe that. Again, I could be wrong. I wasn't there. None of us were there. And it really breaks my heart that it even happened. If that's truly what happened, my gosh. Either way, it's horrible. Her DNA was the only DNA found on the knives. Anywhere in that little area. He could have worn gloves. You go through it. But it just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. There was no point of entry. The blood was in one spot. There was no defensive wounds. He would have had to knock her out for there to be no defensive wounds. Because when someone's stabbing you, automatically you're going to put your hands up. It's an automatic reflex. I don't even think you think about it. Here, there was none. No defensive wounds. And there was no blunt force trauma. It's just the totality of the evidence, if you really put piece by piece, and yes, believe me, I'm right with you on the back of the neck. It drives me crazy because it so doesn't fit that it's the one thing that I keep questioning over and over again. And then the second pathologist said that she did hit the spinal cord. If that's true, then the case is solved. It was a homicide and it would have had to have been the boyfriend. He's the only person outside of her that it could have been. It is a disturbing case. And not only that, it does make me crazy a little bit that they didn't at least question him further. Yes, had this been a small town or something like that, yes, they would have definitely been on him. He was the last to see her. I'm surprised that they let him kind of slide. They really did. When they walked in, they must have just thought suicide. And because they see so many, I don't think they were thinking she stabbed herself. I think when they walked in, they just saw no point of entry. She's sitting there in the middle of the floor, and the blood was self-contained in that area. And then going through like her texts to her mom, the initial interviews with the parents, they were saying different things than they're saying now. Do I blame them? Absolutely not. If it was my daughter, I'd be equally as furious and I'd be wanting everyone to pay. I wouldn't believe it not for a second. I'm just an unbiased person looking at this. If you're involved in this, it would make me crazy. It's just such a shame. And I feel for her parents. I mean, my heart goes out to them. They got to be so upset. She was a really pretty girl. So that's the case of Ellen Greenberg. I am literally looking around to make sure I didn't miss anything. Perhaps I will have to tape this again. I tape things over and over until I am satisfied that I've told you everything. And everything looks like it's been told. For Ellen Greenberg, my prayers are for you. My prayers are for her parents. I hope they find peace somewhere in this mess. I think it happened a while ago. I don't know why the case came this... I just can't believe I hadn't heard of it before. It happened in 2011. Why is it? It's 9 years old. In the Philadelphia Inquirer, Ellen, a 27-year-old elementary school teacher, had been discovered seated on the kitchen floor inside her locked Manayunk apartment with a serrated knife plunged 4 inches into her chest. A strainer filled with blueberries and an orange appeared freshly sliced, rested on the counter. 2 clean knives were in the sink. Wow. And then they say the Emmy's office made a rare flip-flop. It's not a rare flip-flop. They always initially give their response, and then the more information that comes, then they might change it or may not. I just don't understand the extent of her daughter's injuries. The problem with this is if she was getting beat, that's it. She's got so many different injuries on her. It's really hard to separate anything. I truly believe that I know somebody, it was another podcast. I think it was Generation Y. He put it perfectly. Ellen was silently suffering. And that is exactly it. Silently suffering. I think she tried to reach out, but a young girl that's got all that going on and probably grew up in a really, kind of, a lifestyle that wasn't hard. And then to be hit with so many hardships so young, I could definitely see suicide. I mean, if you're going batshit crazy, think about it. I mean, especially for women, like the women in the audience, really think about it. For me, see, I hate to admit this, but it's the truth. My hormones they wreak havoc on me. Up and down, up and down. I hate to use that excuse, whatever you want to call it. It's true. At some point during the month, I always feel like I'm going to scratch my eyes out. Now, if you're in a depressed mode and then that, who knows what point she was at. That I could totally see. Like, you just start going nuts, like banging your head against the wall or stabbing yourself. Stabbing in the back really bothers me. It's stranger things. It is a strange case. And I can be easily swayed from my suicidal standpoint. When I think of Ellen Greenberg, I wonder, did she have like a best friend? Is there somebody she could confide in to, talk her through this? Was she feeling all alone? That bothers me more than anything else. I do have a tremendous amount of empathy for Ellen Greenberg. And with that, this is Debbie Q with The Right Shoe.